Today we have some more actual history about the beginning of the American Republic. This is a bonus episode, and it is a little bit different than the typical episodes on this channel. We usually cover a particular story that happened to people who lived long ago, but in this episode we are going to read more of an overview of the entire period that roughly began with the outbreak of the French and Indian War in 1754, and ended with the War of 1812. Specifically, we will be reading the preface of this book, Incidents of Border Life by Joseph Pritts, published in 1838. To date, we have done a total of 13 episodes from this book, and there are still many more stories from this book that we will cover in future episodes on this channel. In some of these prior episodes, I have alluded to the story behind the book. So in today's episode, I thought it would be good to hear the complete story of why Joseph Pritts decided to compile this book in the 1830s. So here is the preface written in 1838 of one of the greatest historical records of the American Revolutionary period, Incidents of Border Life. Several years since, the compiler of this work was in company in a stagecoach with two gentlemen of the clerical profession, on our way to Philadelphia. In the course of the journey, the conversation happening to turn upon the early history of the region of country through which we were passing, one of our companions was very naturally led to touch upon some of those remarkable and stirring incidents of border life, to which the almost constant state of hostility between the white settlers and the aboriginal inhabitants so abundantly gave rise. The other of our companions, a gentleman distinguished for his piety, learning, and rarely surpassed powers of oratory, became so much interested in the subject of discourse that he inquired with some earnestness of manner where he should be able to procure a work from which he might become more intimate with the details of those frontier events. To this it was replied that it was to be regretted that the written history of these times was so very meager, and that even what little is found a record in the detached and homely narratives of some participators in these frontier adventures, or in the equally unpretending and fragmentary chronicles of other but contemporary writers of their deeds, had almost passed from the reach of the general reader, books of this kind having become extremely scarce. The result of the conversation was an expression of an increased desire on the part of the clergyman to obtain a particular work devoted to the subject, and of a determination on our part to collect as many of the printed fragments of that part of our country's history as a diligent research might enable us to procure, and from the collection and such additional resources as might fall within our reach, to compile a volume embracing whatever might seem interesting and suitable to the design and scope of the desired work. Though years elapsed without putting us in possession of the sought-for materials as fully as we wished, we flatter ourselves that we have at length succeeded in bringing together such a collection of narratives and detail of adventures as to seem sufficiently copious, authentic, and interesting to justify committing them to the press and the judgment of the reading public. In presenting this work to his countrymen, the compiler feels that he has mistaken the American taste, and greatly overrated the value attached to the contents of his book, if it does not meet with a welcome reception. It would be strange indeed if at a period when even the most extravagant and frivolous creations of fancy find ready consumption in the perhaps growing appetite for the marvelous and romantic, a narration of exciting scenes known to be undoubted facts, and presented in the unadorned language of truth, should be less acceptable. If the admiration and sympathy of readers can be so strongly enlisted in the heroism and suffering that never existed save in the creative imagination of the novelist, how much more readily and rationally should their sensibilities be touched by the noble daring, the toils and sufferings of the pioneers, seeking amidst ceaseless peril to convert a howling wilderness into a land flowing with milk and honey, and preparing the way for us, their successors and children, to sit down in peace under our own vine and fig tree, where there are none to make us afraid. On many accounts, we think our volume must be received with great eagerness. As already intimated, there have been but few books ever offered to the world, whether of real or fictitious adventure, so rich in varied, thrilling, and wonderful incident. From the first sound of their axe on the borders of the wilderness, through all the successive stages of improvement, until the forest was gradually cleared away and other frontier settlements formed by other kindred adventurers, to be in their turn the scenes of wild and daring exploits, interposed to shield the first against the predatory incursions of a never-tiring foe, the original settlers of any given portion of the country, whose early history it is intended to illustrate, passed through so many strange and exciting events that the unadorned record of the life of any one of these backwoodsmen appears far more like an ingenuous romance than a sober and veritable biography. We do not purport to give a book made up entirely of the memoirs of individual adventurers. For the most part, our volume is filled with only the most remarkable incidents occurring in the settlements, of which any account has been preserved. It is much to be regretted that the entire lives of many more of the pioneers of civilization are not recorded. A few such, however, are to be found in the following pages, and we defy any reader of the least pretension to literary taste to take up any one of these, the life of Colonel James Smith, for instance, with which our volume begins, and perusing it as a mere storybook, independent of its value as a record of very interesting events, and not pronounce that simple and artless narrative one of the most charming compositions he ever read. It is but recently we heard one of our friends, alas now no more, a gentleman of a remarkably classic turn of mind, and keenly alive to all that is beautiful in literature, exclaim unconsciously to himself, as he rose from the perusal of it, "The untutored Defoe!" We have often thought since how appropriately this term was applied. We see throughout the whole narrative told in language always plain and simple as a child's, though in some places it is true, not quite grammatically correct, the same minute yet tiresome detail of circumstances, the same descriptive manner of relating events as they appear to have occurred, which have made Robinson Crusoe a favorite of all, from the boy just beginning to read, or the unlettered servant girl half spelling through its pages, up to those most distinguished for learning and cultivation of taste. But rich in wonderful yet at the same time apparently natural incidents, as this best production of Defoe undoubtedly is, we deem it even to be surpassed in that respect by the humble sketch we have just ventured to compare with it. And what has been said of this first article of our volume might be said also, to a certain extent, of nearly every one that follows. We have referred to it as a specimen merely because of its place, and not because of any great superiority, either in matter or in manner, it possesses over a number of other articles, except that it is somewhat more complete as a biography. Our whole book throughout abounds with scenes and adventures equally romantic, and many of them are described as artlessly and as well. Indeed, what almost everyone knows generally of the kind of life led by the first settlers in the middle and some parts of the western states will serve to convince him that our compilation must be a work of no little interest. Almost everyone knows something, yet how indefinite is his knowledge, of the early history of this now flourishing part of the country. He may have some general notion of brave men starting out with their families from homes of security and settling in little groups in the wilderness, erecting their log cabins in their clearings, and a rude stockade fort near the center of each of these little colonies, to which, at the alarm of an invasion, their wives and children were seen hastily flying, of the whole of one of these little settlements assembled at times of extraordinary danger, and going from farm to farm to plow their fields, or to cut down their harvest, their rifles all the time at their sides, or ready to be seized at a moment's warning, of savages lurking in the woods, shooting down whoever ventured to go forth, unarmed and alone to his labor, then rushing into the undefended door to kill or carry into captivity all the inmates of his dwelling, of desperate conflicts between the white settlers and their savage foes, sometimes one party victorious and sometimes the other, of fugitive Indians pursued into the heart of the wilderness, and the captives they had carried off, perhaps the wives, children, brothers, or sisters of the pursuers rescued, of other prisoners when pursuit was either unsuccessful or not made, sometimes making their escape by the way, then chased by their disappointed captors, and if not again taken, wandering days and nights in the forest, without food or the means of procuring it, and at length reaching their homes, perhaps only to find them desolate. Sometimes less fortunate, bound to the stake and expiring in tortures, and sometimes carried to the Indian villages, adopted into their families, and becoming learned in their language and traditions, their manners and customs, modes of life and of warfare, and then perhaps after long years of captivity, returning to their friends and describing all the the wonders they had witnessed during a sojourn among a strange and uncivilized people. But beyond these vague generalities, how few know anything of the life these settlers led. Yet who that knows aught of that life does not long to know more? Who that has heard of such incidents as we have now just enumerated does not feel a longing desire to hear them described at length with all their attending circumstances? To gratify such a feeling as this was one object of our compilation. Whether we have succeeded to the satisfaction of our readers, it is for them to determine. But for our own part, we repeat, we would not know where to seek, whether in the pages of fiction or of history, a relation of events more romantic, or possessing a more absorbing interest than any of the narratives we have given to the public. But it is not merely as a collection of entertaining and wonderful adventure, to be read for a winter's evening amusement, and then to be thrown aside as a thing of little worth. Our volume recommends itself to the American reader. It is still more valuable as a faithful chronicle of the times of which it relates. Decidedly the most interesting portions in the history of any part of our country are those relating first to the period of its early settlements, and secondly to that period commencing with the French and Indian War, and terminating with the struggle of the Revolution. But it so happens that in the greater part of the region of country, whose early condition this work is intended to illustrate, these two periods exactly coincide. Partly for this reason, and partly for others we shall presently mention, do we deem that very region of the country the scene of more varied and stirring adventure than has been witnessed in almost any other section of the land. The incidents of a frontier settlement, and the incidents of one or the other of the wars referred to, all taking place at the same time. In the character of the aboriginal tribes, who disputed with the settlers of this region the occupancy of the lands, and in the features of the country where their contests were had, may be found other causes both to multiply the adventures and to render them remarkable, beyond those of any of our other frontier settlements. The Indians who here resisted the advance of civilization were certainly the most heroic and warlike race that ever claimed a portion of the territory we now call our own, and they kept up a more prolonged border warfare than was elsewhere witnessed in defense of it. During a great part of this protracted warfare, the white settlements were on the eastern side of the mountains, and the Indian villages on the western. The mountainous district between, while it served as a barrier to the tide of civilization, afforded secure hiding places to small war parties of the Indians, whence they could wait a favorable opportunity, and make an unexpected descent upon the settlements, and then again sheltering them in the fastnesses of the hills, until at their leisure they could make good their retreat. And when the intrepid pioneers at length ventured across the mountains and established themselves in the western valley, they were so few in number and removed so far beyond the reach of any assistance their countrymen might have rendered them, that they were enabled to maintain themselves in their new homes against the formidable attacks of their more numerous adversaries only by engaging in the most desperate conflicts. During such a period, and in such a condition of the frontiers, more remarkable scenes must have been enacted every year than have been witnessed within the same extent of country in any half a century since. But for many reasons it is of this period that we know the least. The adventurers had too much to do than to write their own history. Indeed, most of them knew far better how to wield the axe or the rifle than the pen, and even of those who lived to enjoy in the evening of their days the quietness of a safe and peaceful home, and who were skilled enough to record the various adventures of which they had been witnesses or had borne a part, few, it is evident, thought the occurrences of their eventful lives worth the trouble of narrating. Such incidents as to us would appear strange were to them of everyday occurrence, and perhaps they thought as little of them in many instances as the men of our own day do of the ordinary events of theirs. We suspect, however, that of the few memorials of the times that have been in print, some have been lost. They may have fallen into the hands of those whose bad taste would lead them to despise the homeliness of the style in which they were written, and to cast them aside among the rubbish of forgotten things. This we know, that it was with great difficulty we were enabled to procure a number of the most interesting narratives in our volume. The copies of them to be found must be extremely scarce. What few remain of these homely but at the same time valuable and highly entertaining productions, It is one main object of our publication to preserve. It is a duty which we of the present generation owe to the memory of the pioneers of civilization in the region where we dwell, to gather up with religious care whatever records of the times there are left, and, studying them well, to transmit them in as enduring a form as possible to the generations that succeed us. We, the children of these hardy adventurers, and the posterity that comes after us, should know how much we are indebted to them, in order to appreciate as we ought the blessings we enjoy, purchased and secured to us at such an expense of peril, suffering, and toil. How different from ours is the life they led! But where, save in these fragments of history we have endeavored to snatch from oblivion, can we obtain a correct knowledge of their times? If we form of them an idea from a comparison with what at present we may see going on, our impressions must be altogether wrong. There is nothing in the world now that in the least resembles the border scenes of that period. The frontier adventurers of our own time differ as much from those of that day in all their habits and circumstances of life, as the open prairie lands where the settler now finds his field ready for the plow differ from the thickly wooded country where the earlier pioneer cut his way through the forest to make himself a farm. From the materials in our hands, we might have attempted a general outline of the history of the period we have undertaken to illustrate. We might have given a more connected narrative of the frontier events we wish to preserve, and concluded with a general description of border life and border character of the period. Such attempts have often been made, but they are usually wanting in interest. They fail to give any vivid impression of what they describe, and very frequently they are only calculated to mislead. We have chosen rather to give our incidents of border life in detached pieces as we found them, and especially where the adventurers themselves or those who were their contemporaries have related the events of their times. We have greatly preferred preserving their own stories in their homely language. Their deeds are best told in their own words. We have scarcely changed a syllable. This the taste of some may condemn, but in our opinion it is one of the chief merits of the work. To have altered the style of the witnesses would have greatly marred and weakened their evidence. To have attempted to improve the pictures they have drawn would only have destroyed their identity. They would have been no longer, as they are now, perfect representations of border life. Scenes of days gone by, fixed at the time in enduring colors by the rude but faithful artist, who were witnesses of what they painted with such untutored yet graphic skill. So that's it for this episode. This follows up our recent episodes, which covered some of these dramatic incidents of border life. I will put a link to the Incidents of Border Life playlist in the description below. As Joseph Pritts said, we owe it to the memory of the pioneers of civilization to gather with religious care what fragments remain of the history of this time period and to transmit them to future generations in as enduring a form as possible. I started this YouTube channel for similar purposes. For better or worse, YouTube is more popular today than is reading books. Yet there are so many interesting stories lying dormant in old books, and the goal of this channel is to bring those stories to life. If you'd like to support the mission of this channel, then consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a YouTube channel member. For $5 per month, you will have access to our members-only videos, and you can cancel your membership at any time. Members will also be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.